The text said, "Bring the red tie. It was meant for me." Hook. The message arrived at 6:11 the way trouble always does in my life, casually with good manners. "Bring the red tie," it said. "Back entrance on Ellis. Ask for room 9. Don't knock, just come in." Beneath that, a dropped pin and a name I didn't recognize. Jay. The phone was my husband's. He was in the shower, humming the chorus of a song we used to make out to when we were reckless and broke. I stood in the doorway holding his phone like a borrowed heart and thought, the red tie is mine. My name is Simon, 35. I manage a little wine bar that pretends it isn't romantic and fails beautifully most nights. My husband, Eli, teaches set design. He can build a world from plywood and thrift store fabric and light it so strangers gasp as if they've just remembered their first crush. We've been married 4 years. Our apartment has the shape of a promise we meant to keep, and the silence of two men who learned how to be efficient instead. When he stepped out of the bathroom toweling his hair, I put the phone face down on the sink like something delicate. "I'm meeting Jude for a drink," he said, the way someone says whether inevitable, barely interesting. I said I'd close up early at the bar and be home before midnight. We kissed clean, the kind you give a person you dare not wake, and he left wearing the blue tie that makes his eyes insist on themselves. At 9, I closed the register, stacked the stemware, told Marable to lock up after her staff meal. I took a cab to Ellis because curiosity in me is a generous animal that drags me where it wants. The back entrance was a green door with a round brass plate that felt like a coin you don't spend unless you have to. I held the red tie in my pocket. I told a doorman whose neck looked like it had never met forgiveness that I was here for room 9. He looked at the tie and stepped aside. The hallway was carpeted in good intentions and bad acoustics. Room 9 was propped open by a heel, the kind that could pin a man's attention to a corkboard. Inside, low light, mirrors with opinions, a bar heavy enough to hold secrets. Music played the way water sometimes does, sparingly on purpose. Eli was at the far end, laughing with his head thrown back in the way that exposes his throat like a dare. The man beside him wore a suit with the same nonchalance he wore his attention. He turned when I stepped in. He did not look surprised. "You brought the tie," he said, and his mouth tilted like a promise that didn't need witnesses. He reached for it without asking. His fingers slid the silk through mine, then knotted it around my neck as if it had always been his to adjust. When his knuckles brushed my throat, every inch of me remembered the decade we waste pretending we are not bodies. "I wasn't invited," I said, trying to keep humor from breaking beneath the sentence. "You were expected," he answered. Then, as if noticing he'd missed a beat, he added, "Julian." He said it like an answer key. Julian put his palm between my shoulder blades. It wasn't an embrace. It was an edit. Eli turned and saw me. Something like relief passed across his face, followed by something like dread. He came toward us, and the room turned down its volume the way living things do when a story is about to trip over its own feet. "You weren't supposed to see it first," Eli said, gaze fixed on the knot Julian had tied. "You sent it to your own phone," I said, "which I sometimes touch because you sometimes leave it like a pet that trusts the house too much." Julian's hand stayed steady at my back while Eli hovered as if the geography had changed and nobody told our hands. I should have asked the obvious question and left. I didn't. Julian stepped away just enough to let air behave normally again. He handed me a glass of water dressed as something more expensive and said, as if we were all old friends, he asked me to cut the lights for him. I told him I'd only do it if you flipped the switch. I am not a jealous man until I am. The edge in me is dull most of the time, then suddenly a shard of bottle. Eli reached for my wrist. I didn't move. Julian watched us with the concern of a surgeon and the detachment of a museum guard. He was not the villain. He was the stage manager for a scene that had decided to happen without rehearsal. He had the kind of face that gets forgiven on the way in. His tie was loose, his shirt open one button more than manners suggest. I thought of the way Eli comes home smelling of sawdust and theater dust, the kind that clings like confession. I thought of the blue tie he wore for other people, and the red one knotted at my throat by someone who wasn't him. I wanted to be furious and failed in the way that hurts worse. I was curious. "Why here?" I asked, which sounded timid and wasn't. "Why a room without windows?" "Because windows turn the truth into a performance," Julian said. "Rooms like this turn it into a temperature." He leaned in, close enough that the part of my collarbone you can get arrested for thinking about warmed up. YouTube would call it suggestive. My body called it rude to stop. Eli swallowed. He does that when he finds a set's weak spot and decides whether to expose it. "I kissed him," he said, eyes on mine, not on Julian. "Twice. Once because I wanted to be looked at like a new discovery. Once because I wanted to hurt us enough to wake up. Both times I thought of you. Both times I kept going." The worst thing about honest sentences is how they leave no room for the clever retort you rehearsed in the taxi. I sipped the water because otherwise I would have let the glass jump. Julian drifted to the velvet bench by the wall and sat with his hands on his knees, as if he were in church and didn't know what to do with the hymn. "Do you love him?" I asked my husband. The room had its hand to its ear. "No," Eli said, not quickly, not slowly, as if choosing the rhythm would be a lie. "I love how he looked at me when I wasn't behaving. I love the version of me that didn't ask permission to want and forgot to apologize for being obvious." Julian smiled without teeth. "He loves that I am dangerous without being reckless," he said. "It's a mathematics problem in his head. He thought if he solved for me, he'd fix the equation at home." "What would you like me to do now?" I asked. I hated the sentence and loved that it was the only one I could say with the shape of my mouth and not choke. Julian stood and stepped too close again because some men negotiate with distance the way others use money. He put 2 fingers on the tie knot he'd made and tightened it a fraction. "I would like you to take him home," he said. "I would like you to undo that knot yourself in a room with a window. If you decide later you want to watch something burn, call me. I'm very good at fire exits." He moved past me, so close his shoulder glanced my shoulder and left heat tracing down into places that report directly to the brain. He touched Eli's cheek with one knuckle, brief, almost formal, and walked out without looking back. He did not slam the door. It closed with a click like a punctuation mark in a language that knows how to end things. Every part of me wanted to tear the tie off and throw it at the relative of a wall. Instead, I pressed my finger into the knot until it remembered my shape and loosened without argument. I slipped it free and held it between us like a rope we could both grab or let drop. Eli's breath did that thing where it runs ahead like a dog and then comes back sheepish. He took the tie and wrapped it around his own wrist, then mine, not tight, just enough to suggest we might think before letting go. "Tell me," I said, "because sometimes the only way home is through the parts you don't want to label." He told me there were texts and 2 nights, and exactly how long it took to realize he was performing a hunger instead of feeding it. He told me he wanted to be chosen and forgot that being chosen and choosing are cousins who get into the same kind of trouble. He touched the place at the base of my neck that makes the elevator behind my ribs misbehave, and said he would leave if I asked, and never forgive me if I didn't. I kissed him because my mouth knew the map before I did. We kept it clean enough for the platform and dirty enough for the truth. His hands learned what they had taught someone else and came home chastened. My hands wrote apologies into the bridge of his shoulders, and he read them like they were sheet music he'd always guessed at. The bed back at the apartment knew us better, but the room lit itself for us like a stage that had missed our wait. If desire is a language, we were bilingual for an hour and monolingual afterward. It was not redemption. It was a treaty signed with breath. After, I lay with my ear on his chest and counted the rests. He threaded the red tie through his fingers like rosary and said he should throw it out. I told him to put it in a drawer labeled misc, which is another word for maybe. We went home in a cab that smelled like oranges and resignation, and at a red light he put his hand on my knee in a way that looked ordinary from the outside and made my mouth behave. In the morning I made coffee the way he likes, too hot, too honest. I didn't say we were fine. He didn't say we were fixed. We had naked windows and a tie in the drawer and an address for a man who knew how to end rooms politely. When I opened the fridge, there was a bag of hard candy someone had left on the bench outside weeks ago with a note that said for those who keep their hours. I unwrapped two and pressed one into his mouth with my thumb. He smiled around the sweetness, like a man who had decided not to drown just yet. The days after weren't cinematic. We were good at errands and okay at mercy. When he said he was late, I heard the sentence lie down instead of stand on its hind legs. When I said I was tired, he asked what kind of tired. We didn't become saints. We got specific. Twice, I caught my own reflection looking like a man who had moved out emotionally, and I told it to get back in. Once he left the tie on the windowsill like a snake that had decided to sun itself instead of strike. A week later, I saw Julian across the street outside the studio, laughing with a mouth that knew what it could do. He lifted two fingers in greeting the way you signal a bartender across a room, the smallest request for attention, the largest admission of want. I nodded, nothing more. I am not noble and I did not pretend to be. I stood there long enough to feel dangerous and then walked home because I like the way my husband's hand looks, spread on my kitchen table, explaining to me the math of a chair he is building. I like the way my name sounds when he says it into my shirt like it's a place anyone would be lucky to visit. People will ask later, in the quiet tone of bathroom lines and borrowed cigarettes, if there was a villain. They always want one when you admit to the kind of heat that doesn't come with a fire escape. I could say it was the room or the man or the tie. The truth is that the villain was the version of us that forgot to knock on our own door. We learned to stand in front of it again and say where we were. You don't always get to erase the other maps. Sometimes you just choose which one you're going to follow every night, until the paper tears from use and you know it by heart. Tonight at 7:19 I will make a reservation under yes, 2 seats by a window that doesn't argue. If the red tie is still in the drawer, I will wear it, not because I belong to anyone who tied it first, but because I like how my husband loosens it with his fingers when we get home. If I pass Julian on the street, I will nod again, the way men nod when they've met at the precise edge of a story and decided to step back together. If we miss our minute, we will try again at the next. Mercy has office hours for fools like us. We've learned to arrive on time.